Okay. So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Ahmed El Hady today here. So Dr. El Hady did his PhD at the Department of Nonlinear Dynamics and Max Planck Institute for Dynamics and Self-Organization. And then he went to do a postdoc at Princeton University, and that's where we met. And since then, we are actually collaborating for a long time now. And then now he is a group leader at the Cluster for Advanced Study of Collective Behavior that includes University of Constance and Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior. So Ahmed is, he works in several topics, but I would say I will cite 3 topics that he works. So the one topic that he works, actually, he works with marmosets, we mean in vocal communication, but also he works on mechanical propagation in neurons. So he has a theory that says that's actually well, he could explain maybe a little bit about, which is very curious. And the third thing that he worked is what he will present today, which is a mechanistic theory of social foraging. And with that, I would like to thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. And yeah, for the action potential, just a paper in 2015 that I proposed with a collaborator of mine that neurons, the action potentials are electromechanical pulses and not purely electrical. So you can check it out. So today I'm gonna talk to you about stuff I have been working on recently in my research group, which relates to the topic of foraging. So just to give you some motivation why I'm doing this topic, and of course, good. So during my stay at Princeton, when I was doing my postdoc, I was doing typical systems neuroscience experiments, and people will do experiments training animals either in head-fixed configuration or in a very small chambers, and you train them over a very long time in a trial-based structure over short time scale in order to teach them to do a certain task. But recently, there have been a strong interest into really pushing the boundary and going out of this training paradigm in order to study animals doing more naturalistic behaviors that are continuous in time, happen in freely moving behaviors. And on the neuroscience side, there is more push for brain-wide recording, and that's the work I've done with Daniel. So I got very interested in the idea, okay, how can we study this type of naturalistic behavior in a very quantitative manner? Because all the topics that Daniel mentioned, the big drive for me is developing quantitative frameworks in order to study biological phenomena in a rigorous manner. And as someone who lived in New York for a long time, if you have been to New York, yeah, you know that is a famous pizza rat. Yeah, that's a very common thing you see in New York City. You have rats dragging food around. And actually, apart from laughing, we now have a permit to actually track the rats in the New York subway. So I finally get this going. So this is a very basic behavior. An animal takes some food and then try to survive. So all of us, including us as humans, have to self-sustain to acquire energy and search for food. So it's a quite unique behavior, which is a word that all physicists loves. It happens over multiple spatiotemporal scale, and by this I mean, like, you can do foraging in a small arena in the lab, but you can also, it happens in the field on multiple time scale. It's very sensitive to the environmental structure, so animals throughout the evolutionary history have been very good into adjusting their own foraging strategies to different environments. And the things that attracted me the most to foraging, it has a long history of being a quantitative in behavioral ecology. And this is what made me embark on, okay, if I'm interested in decision making, a very basic decision making that the animals are doing is actually the search for food and how we decide to self-sustain and survive through food consumption. In my research group, my approach to foraging, I call it the integrative approach. So just ignore that these are bets. You can any animals. So this just was for a grant. So you have animals, they have their own private information, and they have information from their conspecifics, the social information, and then they take a movement decision towards some resource of food. Okay, you can ask this on you can ask different questions about this. You can ask a question about ecological fitness, why this certain kind of foraging behavior is good for the animal, for the environment, for the life expectancy and reproductive success. And you can ask a question concerning how does the animal use its own private information, its own experience in the environment, inputs from the environment, its interaction with conspecifics in order to integrate this information and perform a foraging decision. You can go deeper and ask, okay, how does this behavioral algorithms are implemented on neural and biochemical circuitry? And today I'm going to focus on this part of behavioral algorithms and give you a flavor of the type of algorithms we are hypothesizing that might be involved in these behaviors. Okay, and I will present the models is not on the level of what mathematicians will be satisfied with, but there will be quite a bit of equations there. So this slide, I don't need to preach it for this audience, but usually when I present to experimental, it's very important to highlight the importance of models before even doing the experiments, is that models give us tools to think about how to think about a problem like foraging. Okay, it's very easy to just, okay, have an animal running around for food, but how do I formalize this problem? How do I structure the environment in order to study the decision mechanisms underlying this behavior? I like the word intuition pumps from Daniel Dennett, but nevertheless, models are wrong always. And for me, I always remember Sisyphus. Whenever we talk about modeling, you develop a model, you go out the hill, turns out to be wrong, and you come back again. The type of foraging I am very interested in is a very basic problem, which is the patch leaving problem. So we have our animals here. Our animal here enters into an environment that have resource patches. Okay, so the animal goes into, oh, how long is it? Okay, so, yeah, so take care of me, you know that I can go on. So it's, so, so you enter into a patch, consume some food, run resource, and move to the next patch. So the behavioral observables here are the patch residence time, how much time is spent at the patch, the travel time, which is the time you travel between patches, and the food intake, the amount of food you consume. There have been a classical approach in optimal foraging theory called the marginal value theorem. It goes back to the 70s. It assumes that, let's say, the resources in the environment are clumped in patches, and you can imagine the trees, bushes are these patches. And usually when you look in behavioral ecology experimental paper or field studies, you find curves like this, representing time foraging in patch to the cumulative resource intake, and this curves gives you the optimal time in patch. And the marginal value theorem gives us or proposes a rule of thumb, which is that the animal will leave the patch when its current patch intake rate is equal to the environmental intake rate. But when you look at such a rule, you find that it has very strong assumptions, that it assumes that the animal basically know everything about the environment, the food arrival rate, that the food is arriving continuously, and that the environment is static over time and there is no uncertainty. So it's a very strong rule that, you know, these assumptions are very strong. So throughout the talk, I will use it as a very extreme, like guiding principle or an optimality rule that more or less animals don't really follow. So, and this is the, you know, the core of optimal foraging theory is MVT. And then I begin to search, okay, what happened, how, it doesn't tell us how does the animal implement MVT, what happens if there is another animal in the environment, what happens if the environment is changing. And this is what made me, okay, realize that there is a lot of mechanistic questions that are not really answered. And I formulated these 4 questions that we'll try to cover throughout the talk, which is, first, how does the animal can implement something like this marginal value theorem like rule? The second thing is how to account for stochasticity in the foraging process or in the environment. And the very basic question, okay, you assume that the animal knows the structure of the environment, but how does the animal get to learn the structure of this environment? And the last one is, can we extend these models to the social realm? And just to give you the upshot before going into the details, and throughout from 2019 till now, we are trying to answer most of these questions. And I will give you a flavor of, or some of the cases we have treated to get you a flavor of the type of models we have developed. And we have developed a heuristic accumulator model that will answer the question of the implementation of MVT. And then we adopt a Bayesian approach in order to deal with uncertainty in the environment. And then we generalized this accumulator model to account for social information. Okay, so let's begin by the accumulator model. So we called it the foraging drift diffusion model. And I'm sure for this audience, anyone familiar with stochastic processes, drift diffusion model here is, okay, so just to give you the intuition, if you have an animal, let's imagine I'm here the rat, I'm entering into a patch of food, and let's assume I have a decision variable in my brain that is at this point 0, and then I'm consuming some food, which is, let's say, this pellet, this orange clicks here, and over time, I'm building this decision accumulation is, this decision variable is accumulating evidence over time till reach a threshold, and here's the meaning of crossing the threshold, it's the animal will leave the patch, okay. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just to be clear, so the stimuli bias actually the dynamics toward the top. Okay.
Yes, because you have a drift rate drift. And you have noise.
And the drift is only during the stimuli.
Yes.
Okay.
So it kicks and then it. Good. What? No, it's just an abstract cognitive variable. No neurons here. I have. There is no single neurons throughout the whole talk. So, but there is experiments. Experiments have been done in trained animals. You can train rats. I have done this experiments on this evidence accumulation task, and then you can get neurons that do ramping activity, which is an integration. This is what people call integration operation in neurons. Yes. Yeah, mechanistically, can interpret some of the observations we see why this type of dynamics. Cool. So, and then we can characterize, we can take into account more complicated parameters, the initial food density, the patch size, the type of the food, and the travel time between patches. So let's just quickly look at what the equations of the model are, is that the animal have to do two things. First is keeping track of how much, sorry, I need to put all the parameters, keep track and estimate the available energy of the environment with some time scale. And the second one is for anyone who worked with decision models is a purely drift diffusion model where you have X here is the decision variable that is have some time scale, and then you have your own drift rate here, and then the added noise. And then if you simulate this coupled equations, you get exactly the graphs that I had here that was drawn by hand. Here you get the evolution of, if you simulate the full probability evolution beginning from 0 here and at the arrival of the evidence, you can see over time as it gets more evidence, it approaches the threshold. Okay. And the natural question that comes is, okay, what is the threshold and how do we compute this threshold? And then you can compute this threshold optimizing for MVT, for example, like under some MVT. You can write down many equations, but at the end, the threshold that optimize for marginal value theorem depends on a couple of important parameters, which is the patch size, the drift rate, the initial food rate, and metabolic cost. So here we will, during this whole talk, I will not discuss the metabolic cost with the assumed constant. For me, the most important parameter that we played with was the drift rate. Okay. Why? Because we thought, okay, if we vary that, so how do we get different strategies? So let's say, okay, we have this threshold and then we have this accumulation dynamics. There are a couple of things that the agent or the animal can do inside the patch. The animal can count the number of food pellets inside this patch or can estimate the density of food inside the patch. So which is which strategy and under which conditions they do this. So when we plot the drift rate to our threshold, we get two main type of strategies. A type of strategies that we call decremental strategies, which happens in this area when the drift rate is negative and when the threshold is negative. I will explain this further in the next slide. And what we call increment-decrement strategies, which happens when the drift rate is positive and when threshold is positive. So what does this mean? So you can look here, increment-decrement strategy means it's more likely for the agent to stay in the patch when it's find food. So we have here the positive threshold, and we have a positive drift, so I'm going up whenever wherever I have like food that I'm receiving. And the decrement strategy is, we see again here, we have the negative threshold here, and we have this negative drift rate whenever we receive food. Okay, you get two strategies, but do they coexist? What do they depend on? So there is one thing in the beginning of the talk I mentioned, which is the sensitivity to the environmental structure. So we found that either strategies will be optimal in a particular environment, or to be precise, in a particular context in which the animal know or don't know a particular thing about the environment. So for example, if the animal doesn't know the amount of food per patch, okay, so there is an uncertainty in the food density, so the most optimal strategy is basically this density, this increment-decrement strategy, which is a density estimation strategy. I need to approximate the mean of the food density inside the patch. And we can, if we want to prove this experimentally, you can look at you can plot the patch food density. By varying the patch food density, you can increase the patch residence time. Okay. The other strategy, this decrement strategy, is optimal when the animal knows the amount of food per patch. So let's say I know that there are 4 chunks of food. So you remember the plot when we have the negative threshold and the negative drift. So I eat 1, I know that there is 3, I eat the second, third, till I leave. Okay, so here what we did is just, we assumed some decision heuristic. We kind of imagined how would the animal solve this problem using this accumulation process. But we got a very important feedback from the reviewer of this paper is like, okay, can you derive these decision strategies normatively or in a more systematic manner? And here we turned our attention to use a Bayesian approach. And the Bayesian approach, which I'm sure many of you know, is a statistical learning procedure. And in this case, you say that the agent accumulates some evidence about the patch or an environmental quality and use it in order to optimize its foraging in the environment. And there is a long history of using Bayesian approach in studying foraging. And people have tried to see, okay, if animal capable of Bayesian updating, do they use this, Bayesian mechanisms during foraging? But the models proposed within behavioral ecology have been quite restricted in their application, and it's also thinking of future-wise doing neuroscience as animals or fitting to motion data or body posture. These models are very difficult to relate to the data. So what do I mean treating the patch foraging problem as a statistical inference problem? So let's zoom out and imagine what kind of problems is the animal trying to solve in an environment. So the first one is to find a habitat, and the habitat is like a big forest or what you can approximate as a non-depleting patch. So you can imagine it as like a resource of food that doesn't deplete over very, very long time scale. But once the there is a habitat that the animal is interested in or found that it is rich enough, it enters and then begin to do this patch exploitation tasks that I have focused on before, which is approximated by depleting patch. So the procedure is easy, is that the animal, let's say an animal in its mind has some prior probability over the environment richness. It enters into a patch, it encounters food, and use the food encounters in order to update its belief. And then it constructs a posterior probability over this. And you can write down it in terms of Bayes rule, where here T is the number of food encounters at time T, and the prior distribution of yield rates, which is the reward rate of this patch. And then you can do simulations and see that the maximum likelihood estimation of this reward rate approaches the true one over long time. So that was our thinking about, okay, how we can systematically begin to study the problem, assuming that they begin from, they are using a Bayesian mechanism. We can discuss the choice of the mechanism afterwards. So the first problem is the habitat selection problem. So let's first try to think about this problem. Is that if I have 3 habitats, which are like, you can, as I said, is like a non-depleting patch. One is very rich, and ones that have intermediate richness, and one have low richness. So let's think how the animal will try to solve this problem. Is will begin to move between these habitats, but over time, it will realize, okay, this is the most rich one, and then will remain there asymptotically forever. So maybe in the habitat selection problem, the strategy the animal is employing is to minimize the time to find a high quality patch. And if this rich habitat is very obvious, then it will strongly shape the animal behavior, will find it very quickly. But is this true in the type of models we are proposing? So let's study the most basic problem in the habitat choice, which if you have 2 habitats, so if you have binary environment, you have done it to ternary and more, is if you have this binary environment that have high reward rate and low reward rate, and they occur with a certain probability PH and PL. And here you can write down the belief equations, the partial differential equation where you have the evolution of the belief have 2 terms. One that account for the food encounters inside the patch, and one about the amount of food that is decreasing. So how can I represent this graphically? I think it's really nice to get the intuition from this graph, is that over time, YT here is my belief. Let's say I begin in the high patch, then I go in the low patch, then I go to the high, I go to the low, and I keep doing this moving between high and low till I asymptotically stay in the high patch and ultimately leave after a threshold totally the low patch. So this is the setting of the problem, the basic understanding, and everything afterwards is to try to get a more quantitative analytical handling over the different parameters here. So what the animal is doing here, the best strategy is to do a sequence of stay and go decision till I arrive and remain in this high patch. And because it's, this partial differential equation, we can get the first passage time of the process, which is a minimized arrival time here in this okay and not very ugly equation. It depends on the escape probability from the high patch, and on the time to exit the high patch, and the time to exit the low patch with some transit time between the patches. So here, the important thing is that I keep mentioning time, and this is a strong deviation from the marginal value theorem, which depends on estimating the underlying reward rate. So here we want to optimize this arrival time. I want to find this minimal time that will make me realize that I am in the high patch and just stay there. Okay, so let's play a bit with the model. So, okay, we want to minimize the arrival time. So what happens if we keep this low patch at 1, let's say the reward rate, and keep increasing the reward rate of the high patch? We minimize more and more this arrival time. And we can basically compute exactly time to arrive. We can fix the discriminability, which is the ratio between the high and low reward rate, and increase, for example, the probability of high patch. And the more we increase the probability of the high patch, the more we minimize the survival time. Okay, so what else we can get? So the nice thing about this type of models is that I always keep talking about threshold, is that the threshold is not something we observe from, you can imagine it's like some kind of an abstract cognitive variable in the brain of the animal that is crossed, for example, when it's, okay, now I am in the high patch, I will stay there asymptotically. So you can compute this optimal threshold and look at its dependencies on the high yielding rate and the more rewarding habitat, and the more we increase the value of this rewarding habitat, the more we basically minimize this optimal threshold. So in this case, in the habitat selection, what basically, if you haven't been following all the equations I presented, what the animal is doing is a very basic operation, which is computing the log likelihood ratio of the high yielding patch to the low yielding patch. And basically, interestingly, in this non-depleting patch case, this is generalized into almost n habitats, where usually the animals will tend to do the log likelihood ratio of the first two richest habitats. So it seems that here, what we are proposing is that the animal might be minimizing the time to find the high quality patch, which I personally find very interesting, because this is a very strong deviation from the marginal value theorem. But we still need to check whether it's true or not. Okay, Daniel. Because the marginal value theorem depends on rates. So I'm computing rates, reward rate all the time. I'm not looking at minimizing the time of arrival, right? So if I go to the high patch, I'm just sampling, but I'm not computing the full posterior probability over the reward rate. I'm just trying to minimize over time, sampling till my belief tell me, okay, I am over a threshold, but not the exact underlying true reward rate. Of course, they have to approximate it, but it's not like they find their whole aim is not to just find the underlying reward rate of the maximizer. Cool. So what happens if you just change one thing about these patches and make them depleting? So let's play this game. If you have three environments, and one is have a high reward rate, low reward, medium, and then low. But in this case, the patch is depleting. So here the animal will keep sampling and keep going over time, will spend more time in the patches that have a higher reward rate, and will tend to have more residence in these patches, because they're just depleting, and not like the previous case where it's non-depleting. Depleting is the more realistic one that we think of, because I'm eating some resources and then that going away. So if there is no uncertainty about the environment, if the animal knows the full distribution of everything in the environment, we basically recapitulate the full marginal value theorem here. But if there is uncertainty, then there is some deviation from the marginal value theorem predictions. And deviation means that they will under-harvest or over-harvest. Like, let's say if we have the marginal value theorem is our optimal, will give us some optimal patch residence times, the animals can stay longer, which will be over-harvesting, or shorter, which will be under-harvesting. So here in the case of depleting environments, in the construction of the belief equations, the animal is trying to optimize a long-term reward rate. It's not trying to minimize time like we saw in the habitat selection problem. So the animal need to estimate this underlying yield rate, and then we'll leave when this falls below a certain threshold, and then keep doing this as it moves between patches. Just to jump a bit to the interesting part here is what we have seen playing with the simulations is if we have some uncertainty in the decision process, so some noise, as we decrease the amount of food in these patches, the animal will get to deviate more and more. So let's say here is a marginal value theorem patch resistance time distribution. The animals will tend to leave the high patch to more when there is less food in the environment, and they will stay in low patches too long. So it seems that the big thing that really controls how uncertainty shapes the decision strategies of the animal is the amount of food in the patches. If I have so much food, it looks like they fit the marginal value theorem predictions, and that's in line with a lot of the literatures that have kept saying, okay, we can observe marginal value theorem in nature, but if you look deeper into the data, it's because they looked over very large-scale recordings and in areas where there was abundance of resources. So the more scarce the resources, we will expect more deviations from the marginal value theorem. So in the case of the depleting environment, so that's changing one parameter about the patches, the animal here then switches from computing the stock likelihood ratio between the richness of the patches into computing a maximum likelihood estimation of the arrival rate, which is the richness of the patches over time. Why is this important? Because a lot of physiological recordings or other neural recordings, when people do, for example, decision-making mechanisms, trying to look for some latent variables in some brain areas, and would say, okay, if we change just one thing about the structure of the environment, are we shifting some of the neural mechanisms employing to solve a certain problem? So just quickly on the learning part is you can generalize against this Bayesian framework to look at, okay, how does the animal will sample the environment in order to get some approximation of the how many, let's say, here we have two types of patches, high and low. How long would it take them to know that there are two types of patches in the environment? And we can run some simulations and see, okay, over time, they can basically do, again, this maximum likelihood estimation to approximate the true underlying reward rate, let's say here in the non-depleting case. And the more richer the patch is, easier it's to get it. And then in the depleting case, it's a bit more difficult, because it's a depletion. So it's very hard. It's not easy for them to estimate the underlying reward rate. And then we see that, in the non-depleting, it's easier for them to learn the reward rate because it doesn't deplete over a short time. And one can ask a question, okay, so why are you using a Bayesian mechanism? There is an RL mirroring of this same learning mechanism that was just published last year. Yeah, that's a big discussion, which type of mechanism to use. For me, it's Bayesian mechanisms are more mechanistic in nature, and we can relate it to neural and physiological recordings afterwards. So just a short recap before moving to the next part is that we developed over the last couple of years a flexible frameworks that allow us to model this type of evidence accumulation in patch leaving decisions. So we can have what we call a habitat selection problem or the patch exploitation problem, where just by changing one characteristic of the patch, we are able to shift the decision strategies of the animal from this log likelihood ratio computation to the maximum likelihood computation. And the thing that we are very interested in testing afterwards is like how this amount of food in the patches and the uncertainty in the decision process really shapes how they deviate from the optimal marginal value theorem predictions. We have also shown that the animals can learn the food arrival rates quicker in depleting environment. So what we did with the social foraging was a very basic extension. We just said, okay, instead of one accumulation process, we have two accumulation processes in this case. So you have two accumulation processes evolving over time and they're coupled. So you can couple these two processes with social information term. Here we propose one is a diffusive coupling. A diffusive coupling means, both deciders are evolving over time, but they track their decision variables over time. It's like, it's like mind reading, like we have, and then they cross the threshold depending on how they are coupled in terms of tracking each other. But there are the other coupling, which is the pulsatile coupling, which, okay, they don't care about each other decision processes evolution, but when one depart, the other immediately depart. And this is what we call the pulsatile coupling. These are just the basic mechanisms. We first thought, okay, if we just generalize from having one forager with an evidence accumulation process, what happens if we have coupled? And then if we look at what this coupling does, the most salient thing that it does is this coupling of this belief states. These two processes will increase or improve the estimation of the reward rate. And here, of course, we are assuming that there is cooperative dynamics, because you can imagine, for example, here dynamics where if there is competition, that there will be like, they try to delay each other from leaving, and then the reward rate estimation will be affected. But here we assume that there is cooperative dynamics, and that this coupling of belief states increase the reward rate compared to the non-case. So just in terms of modeling here, we have shown that, okay, you can take a very basic evidence accumulation mechanism, which people have used in trained behaviors, like if I train rats or monkeys to do evidence accumulation mechanism, to try to get it to conceptualize about a problem like foraging, using the food as evidence, and then you can use this to infer a couple of decision strategies and try to generalize it to the social domain. And here just two. So there is a lot of extensions in process, thanks to postdoc working with me, is that I first talked about the metabolic cost. I will keep it constant, but there is a lot that goes into the topic of metabolic cost, because the animal is moving, and it's burning energy, so we need to vary this cost in a certain. So we are trying to get some data to inform this. All the models that I talk to is happening in time. These are temporal. I basically ignore any spatial dynamics. So it's not like, there is a lot known about animal movements. So how do we incorporate this in this type of modeling? Okay, what happens if there is a environment? So let's say that this patch is not a good approximation for example, foraging in case of bacteria that forage over a gradient. So, okay, we need to account for this. What happens if I don't have, if I have more than two animals? Can we generalize to large groups? And also here, I didn't really talk about the individuality in terms of the social groups. So what if there is some dominance hierarchy? So there is a lot of work that is still ongoing, but we have some insights specifically on the continuous environment and the large social groups. So till now, I didn't talk about any data. So what do we do with these models? Okay, do I just do models and that's it? No, I can have a couple of applications that I can show you the direction where we are going. So this is capuchin monkeys data from studies in Panama that was collected by some people at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, Meg and Shauhin. And see here, every purple dot is a tree that the capuchin is visiting, and these are the trajectory of the monkey. So you can say, okay, what you can get some, you can do some basic analysis to see you get, and this is a paper we are currently working on, is you can look at the dominance hierarchy and see, okay, you can see that the more dominant monkeys, for example, consume more food than the subordinate ones. You can construct the affiliative social network by just looking at the grooming, how these animals groom each other, and get the directionality by, and more who is more dominant than the other. But then we got interested in this problem and said, okay, let's use our even basic model with this social information fit it to the data. So first, we weren't sure whether this type of models will work or not. So we did some model identifiability to see whether we can reconstruct, infer the underlying parameters of this process. The social information, we have the most important distance threshold, we have the noise and the coupling strength. And then we can get good estimations beginning from 100 trials, which was pretty good. And then this is just some preliminary data from a couple of weeks ago. Using this data that we can begin to fit to these field recordings to get some estimations for this parameter. I would take those with a grain of salt, but just this is to give you some ideas about where do we use this type of models. So the next thing we use them, okay, we have field data, which is, I'm in a behavior institute, but then also there is this very controlled lab experiment. So we have at the University of Constance a very big experimental facility. It's like like an indoor farm. It's like 20 meter by 15 meter, where we can do very complicated experiments, but still under control. So we can reconstruct some of the naturalistic environment of the animal, but keep it under control in order to test some of the quantitative models that we have developed. So now we are working on some locust experiments. So this is my PhD, Madi. She is doing this locust experiments. Locusts are very slow moving, but there is this 150 locusts. We can track each one individually because they are barcoded. And here, just to give you one snapshot, it's very obvious that these are the high patches and these are the low patches. So here we have the same binary environment I talked about before. We have high patches and low patches. And what we are doing now is we just finish this experiments is that we can fit these models, but then also look at some data that inform models back, which is like the type of information that they are exchanging. Is there anything navigational patterns that they do between the high and low pattern? The next project is with, this is up 10 times, is with rats. So we have like a community of rats where we have like, this is approximately 15 rats, but they're split into 4 places. And here just we are observing how they interact over a long time, what's the dominance hierarchy. And then what we are trying to do is to, again, put them in 2 main conditions, resource abundance and resource scarcity, and see how does this shape their foraging decisions. And then we have a project, the third one with Daniel, we are doing with marmoset, also in a patch foraging context. The nice thing about these models, you can notice that they are pretty abstract, so you can use them in order to compare between different species. So it can give us some way to have a quantitative comparison between foraging strategies. And lastly, is a project by Lisa, a postdoc working with me, is basically, it's in Berlin, they have this game where humans can play with each other in order to find resources. So here there is 5 players, and then they search for resources in an environment, and then you can control what each of the players see about the other. So you have kind of control over social information, and we can use this as a playground in order to test some of the social foraging models that we have developed. Okay, I think that's enough for now. And yeah, at the end, I would like to acknowledge people who have worked with me at beginning from Princeton, CU Boulder. My main collaborators there is Zach Kilpatrick and Daniel, of course, and many people at the MPI for animal behavior, and you, of course. Thank you very much. Cool. Questions? Sure.
Okay, it's very nice, your models. And we are working with ants, yes, and the leaf-cutting ants that, yes, have a large, yeah, number of individuals. And where some aspects that you put your user in your model, it's very hard to define as a hierarchical relation. It's not exactly what we find. And also it's very difficult to identify each one of the individuals. Probably we have 5,000 to 50,000 or even more in the nest. And I'm not sure, and we are trying to make exactly this kind of application is, yes, to define how they take the decision to go to one to another point. And do you think when you put there that you have some ideas to large models or large, yes, systems, mm-hmm, you have some approach?
I have some sheet. So when you have two, when I say two, there is some a nice exercise physicists do called core screening. So you can say, okay, if you have this big group of ants, I can treat them as 2 blobs or 3 blobs. I don't need to identify each individual ant, and then try to infer the coupling between them. So begin by a very general model and say, okay, let's say I have 5,000, I can split this, or 3,000 is easier, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, and these are coupled, for example, by some diffusive process. They are sharing information. See whether this fits the behavior or not. But for me, it's like you need to have some kind of a perturbation in the environment, because we have other people who do, so usually collective, I was just talking to him about this, the collective behavior models are, you can say, okay, like the flock of birds, you can fit it very easily by models that optimize the heading and the speed. Okay, but this doesn't tell me how does the individual is implementing this, and that's something I'm very interested in, this problem of the bottom up a bit, like, okay, from the individual bird perspective, how do I even know to optimize the distance, the speed and the heading in a flock? So you can begin by doing this in a bit of a smaller group, but you can create them as a blob. So that's what we are doing now as a large group. We take actually 5,000 locusts, and we try to just say, okay, this is a group, this is a group, and this is a group, and see that's a coupling, as if you have groups of neurons,
Yeah, one of the interesting aspects that we can measure, we use the same that you, but mm-hmm, not with a marker, individual marker, but
yes,
with the evaluating the movement of each one in,
yes,
in a tracking analysis, and we can know the mm-hmm, velocity or the, yes, size of
yes,
the ants. And we know one of that look like to be very important aspect, that is the preference for the day or the night. That could be a very interesting aspect. When we put only the light for 3 days, the ants cannot find the best solution to reach the food. And when you put the night or the moment that without the light, probably we can see something like you stop the system, and that's very important. And for this kind of system, that could be more important than the other aspects that you work at, that there you are modeling with rats. It's a very hierarchical animal and something like that.
So like the locust experiment I presented, so now with the data analysis, we didn't even touch the model yet, and we are seeing that, yeah, we have difference in dynamics in different parts of the day. So you have to decide, okay, do I take the behavior in the morning or at night? So, you know, there is a lot of complexity into the, that goes into the data. So you have two things. You have first the model, okay, quote unquote, model-free analysis to know, okay, where do I have stable, kind of a stable patterns of behavior like you identified, and say, okay, can I have a model that basically account, let's say, for this behavior in the morning? Or you can have this light cycle as a perturbation parameter in your model and say, okay, this is like an input that flips the state of the animal. So let's say there is a stable, if I have a network, and then let's say I put an input, which is the light cycle, that basically changes couplings, that changes into
And one of the things that look like to be a way to work with this kind of system is also not to look for only the space aspect, but the time aspect.
Yes.
Then you can change the moment that you put the food, and then you can see the way that all the system changes, preparing to the presentation that they know that in the previous day that they are presented. Then it's very similar, but it's very different. Also,
yes, yeah. So we try to I think you are right in terms of you must have some perturbation in the system in order to answer, because there is many models that understand just the pure movement of the animals without perturbing. But for us, the perturbation, was the food aspect, was the locust. We just the quantity and the distribution of food, but we basically put it in the same time every day. It's a very courageous student that did this for 2 months. Continuously, non-stop. But okay, there is other things interesting we see is that depending on the distribution, actually, if we have the locusts that are just developing, we can make them solitary or gregarious, depending on the distribution of the environment. So that's one observation that came by luck, So that's why I said that the models that just give us like the conversation we're having, a way to think about things, but we always find things that are unexpected. Find with the moms.
Any questions? So I have a question a little bit about the social foraging part. So I wonder, so your new model is a situation where essentially the only parameter that would matter is that because you have more animals, the food will deplete faster, right? In that case.
Yes, that's a cooperation.
So that would be a cooperation for you. So because I wonder if that's like the model where there is actually, in reality, there is no interaction. Each one is kind of moving individually. The only thing that is changed is because depleting faster.
Yeah, like we are helping each other to infer better the underlying structure, right? Daniel?
Only if the animals learn something from others, no? So
yes, but that's the coupling I'm saying. So there is this diffusive coupling, right? So we are helping each other infer. If my aim, let's say we define by the objective function, you have first your aim is to infer the underlying reward, and me and you enter and we are cooperating, then the time to get into this reward rate is higher. But if you are competing, then we try to sabotage each other.
So essentially you could infer their cooperating depending on how fast they can get to the optimal solution.
That's what I'm hoping to do.
Okay.
Because it's important in rodents, because in monkeys, in non-human primates, to a great extent, the social dynamics are very well characterized in many species. In rodents, is actually, to my surprise, is not very well characterized. And what we have seen from this data, just putting them together over a long time, as you said, the temporal dynamics over time is shifting very strongly. You have one dominant, and then after a week, this is subordinate. So in a way, it will be nice to have tools to infer when are they cooperating and when they are fighting.
In your model, there is a way to, using the same parameters, but suddenly just because the amount of food decreases, change. It could be that when you have a lot of food, they would cooperate, but when there is a small amount of food, they would actually be.
Yes. Still thinking how to implement it. Okay. So that's in the social heterogeneity aspect. I said we are adding that's where I want to get into. You get some phase change. You can make a, like, when you have a dynamical system, you have some phase change at a certain
like phase transition. Also.
Yeah, yeah, of course. You want to hear, yes, something similar. Just you have a control. You will have then the food as your control parameter. But I still haven't found an easy way to do this analytically first, and then because all the models, someone might say these are simple. Just for clarification, we are really focusing on trying to analytically solve this. These models are all analytically solvable. You can extend them in numerical simulations, but
Thank you. Any other questions? No. Okay. So let's thank again.
Thank you very much.